Do you ever have a great pairing like a crust of garlic bread and potato knish?
Or fried pork chops and vanilla ice cream?
And it just makes each part taste different, maybe even better than they would on their own? This is Juxtaposed, the podcast where we bring you two tasty pieces of art to see what they're like together.
I'm your host, Eve Orkin.
And I am Sarah Peacher. Let's dig in. Take it away, B.
All right, so today I'm bringing to the pod the contemporary American fiction writer, Mary Miller. And I'm super excited to talk about her and to explore how her work intersects with the music that Sarah is going to bring next. So Mary Miller is a Southern American writer. She lives and works in Mississippi. I think she's published 4 books. I could be wrong. I didn't fact check this, but the other books are Biloxi, which is a novel, The Last Days of California, which is also a novel, Big Bad World, a collection of short stories, and then Always Happy Hour, which is the collection of short stories I'll be discussing today. So something I appreciate about Mary Miller is her fiction, of course, is really good. The prose is really beautiful, but the subject matter of her work is something that I really was drawn to. It's focused on the lives of predominantly women who live in the South and the Southeast of the United States. And I feel like the dominant narrative of people from those states, specifically like Mississippi or Texas, tend to be one-dimensional, reductive, or caricatures, which is why I love fiction in general, because it allows for nuance and complexity to come to the surface. And I think that has the power to broaden understanding and empathy. I know that after reading these stories, like I was left with just such a feeling of tremendous compassion toward all the characters in here. So a little bit more about the collection. Always Happy Hour is comprised of 16 short stories. Again, it focuses on the lives of women in a range of dysfunctional relationships with men, all moving and living in the South. So class, dysfunctional relationships, the South, alcoholism, addiction are some of the main themes that I saw in this collection. And something else that these stories all have in common is there is an element of sometimes dark humor or even just light humor that adds like a levity to some of the content that's being explored in these stories. So I loved all of them. Like, honestly, I couldn't believe that there were 16 stories in here. Like, I just devoured this book. I think I've read this collection like 3 times. Like, I just am so drawn to the stories. Like, I just keep going back to them and I get a lot more out of the stories as I've gone back and read them. But a few story highlights for me. One of them is the story Uphill. It's centered around a woman who's in a relationship with this deadbeat guy who's been offered money to take photo of another woman who may or may not have been involved in a murder. What makes this story in particular so compelling beyond the plot is the setting. It opens with these characters in an RV trailer park that was recently acquired by the boyfriend who previously lived in his uncle's boat before he sank it. And then before that, he like lived in a van within his boss's garage. So yeah, these characters, like they go on a journey down to, I think, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, again, which is like, I never see those towns or cities or anything ever really explored in fiction. So I just loved it for that. And then I appreciated seeing characters like these that you don't see, and they're given like their full humanity, even if there are some stereotypes like, oh, this couple, like they live in a trailer park, like they're seen for like full people with lives that are worth being seen and explored. So another highlight for me was the story Big Bad Love, which is focused on a female protagonist who works in a temporary shelter for abused and neglected girls. And she forms a close relationship with one of the girls there named Diamond. Something I appreciated about this story is what I appreciated about all the stories, just zooming in on lives and experiences that are often overlooked. This story takes place in Mississippi, which is learned when the narrator states that they live in, quote, one of the poorest states in the country. which a quick Google search yields a list of the poorest states in the country, and Mississippi is at the bottom of that list. Something else I appreciate about this story is the amount of flaws that are given to the narrator of the story, which I hope we can talk about later when we get into our conversation. We learn that she's like ignoring Diamond at the beginning of the story. She leaves this baby unattended on a changing table and then just like leaves her in the crib before heading outside to be with the girls. She steals the girls' prescription drugs. So I feel like there's a lot to unpack in this story and a lot to talk about. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, and that's it for now.
Today, I'm bringing to the table the album Dragon New Warm Mountain I Believe in You by the band Big Thief. So, as the title might suggest by its length, it is quite a lengthy album. It's 20 songs long, but it's so good that I wrote here, I promise you won't get bored. And maybe B can attest to this later as well. I think it doesn't get boring in part because of the variety of genres that are present on the album. Big Thief are primarily known for their indie rock music. They fit into that genre primarily, but there's a wide range of what that ends up looking like on this album, ranging from more of their like folk and country and bluegrass sound to a little bit of trip hop, which is a more psychedelically infused atmospheric genre inspired by hip hop. Lyrically, this album is also just as wide ranging, from songs involving potatoes to dragons to homages to the grandmother of lead singer and lyricist Adrian Lenker. So I was introduced to Big Thief through this concert series that my college put on and that I attended when I was an undergraduate. So at the time when I first discovered them, to be completely honest, I was still developing a lot of my music taste, and I didn't probably appreciate the band as much as I grew to later, for sure. I did really enjoy the concert, so it opened me up to exploring their music, following along with their records as they were releasing them, because they were still pretty early on in their career as a band when I first found them. And I feel lucky to have learned of them fairly early in their career to be able to sort of like see them progress as well, which has been fun. Some of the things I was drawn to most about their records, especially in this one, was Adrian Lenker's brilliant songwriting and just the really thoughtful but sometimes unassuming instrumentation that she and her bandmates back those lyrics up with. What made this album stand out amongst some of their other albums and what drew me to like selecting this one specifically from their catalog was a lot of the playfulness, experimentation that they were bringing to the arrangements for these songs and to, of course, the lyrics too. According to Pitchfork, they recorded this album in 4 different locations throughout the US over the course of several months. So it was a decently sized project, but they're also very talented and hardworking musicians. So they are able to like put together albums fairly quickly. Sometimes albums take like a year, multiple years, but this one they did over the course of a few months. Based on some of the stuff that I was reading, the environment was really playful throughout the recording process because Adrian had just adopted a dog named Oso, and she says he really brought about this environment of openness and collaboration and playfulness amongst the band members. And they started writing and recording this back in 2020, which meant that they had a lot more time and space away from touring as musicians to actually indulge in a more lengthy project like this too. So while we did not enjoy COVID for many reasons, it also gave us this album. So they were working on this project, and they also talked a bit about prioritizing having the music sound like it's recorded live. And that involves using a lot of first takes and allowing for some of the like small weird moments to stay in the final recording. So it's not necessarily super perfect, but it's more real that way. Overall, I just really loved that this album felt quite like hodgepodge, almost like collage like. but everything is stitched together by this like long-standing practice all of the musicians have, both as like a band and as singular artists, because several of the members also have their own projects. Like Adrienne Lenker has separate projects that she's worked on her own, oftentimes with instrumentation from the same band members, but more focused on like what she wants to execute. And there's another member who records as Buck Meek. So they all have sort of their own practices, but they've come together for long enough that it's like more intuitive the way that they put together their albums these days. Let me run through some of my favorite songs. So probably the top one, the first one that comes to mind is definitely Spud Infinity. I really loved what Pitchfork said about this one as well, that it uses, quote, silliness as a route to profundity. And I thought that was just like such a good way to describe it, because the third and fourth verses in particular are some of probably the best pieces of writing I've seen, period. And the delivery makes it really memorable. But the whole time there's also this mouth harp twanging in the background. It's very hillbilly. Almost to a point where it felt comical at first, but like the more that I sat with it and the more that I learned the lyrics and began to memorize them, because the instrumentation and the rhythm of them made it really possible to memorize them, the more that I sat with that, it felt even deeper, because there is sort of those questions of thinking about how we exist in our bodies. Adrienne writes about like how our elbows brush up against the edges of experience, which is like,
Whoa.
what? Yeah. But then she also, in almost the same breath, is talking about how you can't really like lick your elbows. Like,
Yeah.
you were about to.
I know. I was going to see if I could.
But our elbows are on their own. They're brushing up against the edges of experience. And I thought that was just such a beautiful way to discuss the body. And yeah, she also brought up this question in her interview with Pitchfork about like what part of our bodies do we tend to reside in the most? Like which areas do we think about less? The next song after that that I really enjoyed was Simulation Swarm. It definitely was one of the tracks that is a little more electronically focused. It's less of that like hillbilly twang and more in the electronic section. I was really drawn to this track immediately because of Adrienne's writing about like reaching for someone who seems impossible to reach. The descriptions of the lyrics were also quite visceral. The drone of fluorescence is part of a line. There are various forms of feeling wounded. The lyrics, especially at first, were harder to parse. So it took me a few listens before I really like fully fell in love with this song. But Adrienne also, I found out later, Adrienne has also said that the song is relating to her older brother, who is called Andy in the song. I'm not sure if that's his real name, who her mom gave up for adoption when she had him as a teen, and who Adrienne has never met. So she was thinking about her brother. She was also inspired by a period of hospitalization that happened after touring for like 7 years. She was thinking about a breakup that she had been writing about leading up to this album. And then she was also thinking about her childhood growing up in a cult in the Midwest as she was writing this. So there's a lot of feeling colliding in this particular track, and it really shows. It's definitely more like when we think of like lyric versus narrative poetry, definitely feels more on the lyric side of poetry, but it really encapsulates those feelings of like desire, but also like woundedness, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the third track that I wanted to talk about was the title track, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You. And fun fact, there's actually shattering icicles recorded on this track, which is so beautiful. And I've never heard of that on a song before. And lyrically, I also really loved the way that Adrienne is, again, capturing a kind of desire. It feels very different from the Simulation Swarm desire, but it still has that language about believing in someone, and particularly in believing in someone who is perhaps sort of like aloof stony, even dragon-like. And I thought that the descriptions that she used to characterize the other person on the other side of the telephone line kind of thing was really beautiful as well. So both the instrumentation and the lyrics on the title track were something I was really drawn to as well.
I really appreciated what you brought up about the playful experimentation collage like vibe of the album and how it's like kind of an epic album, like 20 tracks is pretty long, but it didn't feel like forced in a way that I'm going to say something controversial and I love Beyonce and I stand behind Beyonce, but her album I feel like was genre bending, but at times it felt like really forced and it didn't feel like it worked the entire time. Whereas this album felt like it all worked. It all kind of flowed. I feel like it's a trend now to do a lot of like genre bending albums and sometimes they work really well. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah, and I think part of what made this one in particular work was that the band has had like a few different sort of eras tied to other albums where they really like focused in on, okay, we're gonna make most of the music sound like this for this album. So they were drawing from those experiences to create like a mega album that just involved previous sounds that they had already worked with and building upon those as well. So I feel like that's part of what makes it even more successful. So I noticed that a dog comes up in the short story that you shared with me, which was Big Bad Love. And I discovered in the creation of Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, there was a dog also running around during that. So, how do you see the dog functioning in the short story? And then maybe we can think about how a dog got incorporated into an album, also, in a way.
Okay, so I think the dog plays an important role in depicting a little bit more about the narrator. The dog, per the vet, is described as bad, and that similar to people, some dogs just come out bad. And I think it is speaking to the intentions of this narrator who deep down wants to do the right thing, but her own baggage gets in the way. Thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely saw that the dog was like really adding to the depth of the main character and helping me understand her a little bit better. And to connect it to Adrienne Lanker when she was talking about her dog, she was talking about how like her dog was like misbehaving one time and she was like I could have had this or this different reaction, and the dog was like trying to be at the dog park, like running away or whatever. And she was trying to get the dog to come home with her. So she was like, she ended up pulling the dog when the dog was distracted and just being like gentle and like getting the dog to her car, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about how like being gentle with the dog is also a way that reminds her to be like gentle with herself in a way. So I think that goes back to even last season when we were talking about the dog in Drive My Car of like
I thought of that.
yeah, of something about dogs in stories is just like helps us understand the character of the main character and like what's going on with them internally in ways that we wouldn't see otherwise.
Yep, I agree. And like caretaking too, like our need to caretake, or the image just came back to me of like her driving next to the dog.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then like that image has stayed with me.
Yeah.
From that movie.
Yep. Definitely. So I noticed there seems to be some light humor, perhaps dark humor, sprinkled both in Miller's short story and also across Big Thief's album. Did you see some of that? Where did you see it? What was standing out to you about it? What role is it playing as well?
I think I see it in a lot of the stories. I think it comes across in the deadpan nature of some of the sentences that Miller's constructing, like from Big Bad Love, the line about, I don't know if this is like I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but this was in the story of the narrator. She says this line about not being obese, and therefore she was tasked with heading up nutrition within, which was like ridiculous and just kind of like a laugh out loud moment. And then in the beginning, with like how the narrator is characterized, I know I spoke about it when I introduced the collection and this story, with the baby being left on the changing table and how the baby just knows not to roll off because, quote, she isn't like the other babies. Yeah, just the way that she's like being characterized, like it's humorous there because this character is like tragic and funny at the same time.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very much that like matter of fact delivery of like this is sort of like a funny circumstance, but then the way that the character is also delivering it like heightens it in certain ways.
Yeah, exactly. And then in some of the other stories, I noticed the humor in her pacing, especially the one like uphill where the two characters are they're kind of fighting about whether the boyfriend should go on this task to get $1,000 for this photo job or not. And it was just like it's a ridiculous thing to even like be considering. And then just like the pacing of them like going back and forth is really funny.
I thought the moment when the narrator says like maybe we can go to the pool later, and then the way that it's written right after that of Diamond screams and tells the other girls and they all scream, and I tell them they'll have to ask Miss Monique and be extra nice for the rest of the day. There are like moments that are quite like light like that, and I feel like it balances out the circumstances that brings all of the characters together. Like it's honestly quite disheartening why the narrator's even connected to Diamond, but there's a lot of levity in the moments that they share together and the way that it's written as well, talking about those moments that they have together. They are able to have fun together, and Diamond seems to trust the narrator more than anyone else as well. To talk about humor in the album, definitely I noticed it most in Spud Infinity, and some of it was because of the instrumentation and how like hillbilly it was. And I feel like that's an interesting
Yes.
connection to this short story collection too, as to like where it takes place a little bit. Like it's different, but also relates in a way. Yeah. And also just like lyrics almost always tend to rhyme, and Adrian has a lot of fun playing with the rhyme, and it feels like the this particular instrumentation for Spud Infinity unlocked something for her where she was able to like just kind of like write whatever and have fun with it kind of thing. But ultimately, like she's a lyricist and she thinks about things deeply. So even
Hmm.
when she's being silly, there's depth behind that silliness.
I want to appreciate something else too. I feel like with lyrics that she has and even the instrumentation of this whole album, I feel like it's brave to put forward something like this where it's like not easily digestible. And I appreciate it because there is a market for it, you know, and like an audience does connect with this. So I don't know. I feel like with music sometimes, not all the time, but like you see it when something's super successful with like Insta poets and whatnot, that it's like kind of fast food ish. Do you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
this is like real artistry and so much thought behind everything that they're doing. And it really comes across. And I feel like you can really connect with that as a listener. So that's all
Yeah.
I wanted to
Yeah.
say.
Definitely. I think a lot too of the like lightness that is like akin to humor comes through in the images that Adrian selects as well. Of like, I was just looking at the lyrics for Red Moon, which is where she like yells out, "That's my grandma." Leading up to that, she says, "What do you yearn for? Where do you long to be? I've been here before, looking at the wild country. Open the screen door, talking with Diane Lee." It's very like everyday images that she incorporates into
Hmm.
a lot of the songs as well, and that's what makes it feel like so in such close proximity to poetry for me, even though it's not like inherently written as poems. Oh, here's a good sort of like follow up question. Where do you see glimpses into some of the depths in Miller's short story? It's told very matter of factly, but there's a lot going on almost behind the scenes or like just below the surface.
Okay, so I see the depth coming through in the very end with this story. She ends up taking Diamond to the mall, which in itself, loving action. But I feel like the heart of the ending is in the interaction that she has with, quote, the blonde in spandex, because the narrator admits to hating herself for wanting to be seen as a good person. And just to give like a little bit more context, there's a conversation that they have where the blonde in spandex asks her if Diamond like belongs to her, and she like criticizes the blonde in spandex, saying that, oh, she's the kind of person that would just come here and just, drop off popcorn and watch movies, but she won't use the bathroom, and like really looks down upon the girls in the house. And then the narrator admits to working at this home for abused girls. And then she hates herself for wanting to be seen like as a good person. And then it's followed up with the comment from the blonde in spandex by saying, oh, I bet that's very rewarding. And that's kind of that's what she wanted the blonde to say to her. And then she's like, oh, not really. And then it goes to this like heartbreaking images of she closes her eyes and then she opens them and she makes eye contact with this old guy who's like licking the ice cream, and they look at each other in this really blank way. I'm going to just read the sentence. Quote, I watch him the same way he watches me, blankly, without interest, and wonder if Diamond will remember that someone loved her once, if she'll have any memory of me at all. So I think it's heartbreaking because she too seems to be really wanting to be loved just as much as Diamond needs to be loved. And that she's really doing this work as like some kind of like need for connection, a need for validation in some way. What did you think of this ending?
It felt like, because of the pacing and stuff too, it felt like the story really like floated along until it got to that moment, that like almost sort of like revelatory moment, but it's also like very quiet and quick at the same time. And I thought it was such a good way to end the story without it getting too like, I don't know, almost like preachy or like too heavy-handed. So I thought the ending was so expertly written and just like made sense, because all along the way there's these little hints of like the narrator is not necessarily like the best person ever. Like she's there doing the work, but it still feels like a job to her. And like the way the descriptions of like her boss and stuff, or like even the other guy, like the inspector or whatever, that would show up like monthly. What was he called?
Bruce. So there was some guy, Bruce. He never showed up, and
Yeah.
he would tell them to study for a test that they were never going to actually take.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's like a lot of, and also like talking about the social workers.
Yeah.
Like in many ways, the narrator is doing a good thing by being there all the time, but also like she isn't necessarily like didn't feel super present, except for maybe with Diamond specifically. But even like you were talking about at the very beginning of the story, she's like ignoring Diamond initially and then gives her attention after that. So it just was so interesting to have a character that was not the worst, but not the best either, sort of somewhere in the middle. And then to have that character also have that moment of revelation at the end of like, I am not really a good person, but I want to be. Like, I want to be seen as a good person. Do you have a favorite song though from the album? Because I told you my favorite three, but I'm not sure if you had a different one that stood out to you.
The Simulation Swarm I loved. Let me go on to my Spotify, because I was listening to it on my walk. I liked how it opened with Change. And I don't know if that's the song where it talks about like the wind and the water. So yeah, I mean, it just felt like very cinematic and philosophical and big at the same time. And then her This is like, I've never listened to this band before, so this is like the first introduction to them for me. And I found her vocals very striking. They sound like kind of twangy. Right away when I listened to it, I thought immediately of how it paired well with Mary Miller's work, just because of that like kind of country vibe, even though they're using it in like completely different ways. Big Thief, I feel like, is just doing like genre blending to just like add more texture to their music, whereas Mary Miller is just showing lives in the South free of stereotype and caricature. But I thought immediately they would make such a good pairing, and I was excited to put them together.
Yeah, I also feel like having Adrienne Lenker's voice, I like that you pointed out what her voice sounds like, but also like she is a female voice, a woman writing this album as well. And I think that also sort of like speaks to what you talked about with Miller focusing on women's lives in the South. So Adrienne's really writing from her experience as a woman and a queer woman as well.
Cool.
I could really see this album like if the short stories were made into like a TV show or something, or like a compilation TV show, this would be great music to put as like the soundtrack to that.
Totally.
Thanks for listening to today's episode about Dragon, New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You by Big Thief, and Mary Miller's short story collection, Always Happy Hour. Please check out our website at the link in the description for more information about this episode. If you have feedback or pairing that you're just dying for us to talk about, feel free to send us a message over on our website or at Juxtapose Podcast on Instagram. We'll be back again in a couple weeks with a special episode where we're switching things up a little bit. We're going to discuss some art that we dislike and maybe even hate a little bit. So we're going to be a little bit of haters. All right. Bye.